The night Alexander was born, the sky above Macedon cracked with storms. In the temples, priests whispered that the gods themselves were restless. Far away, the great temple of Artemis burned in flames, and rumors spread across the ancient world that destiny had entered the earth wearing human skin. In the rugged kingdom of Alexander the Great, legends were not written quietly. They arrived like thunder. His father, Philip II of Macedon, was a conqueror who transformed Macedon from a fractured northern kingdom into a military machine feared by Greece itself. His mother, Olympias, filled the young prince's mind with tales of gods, omens, and divine bloodlines. She did not raise Alexander to become a king. She raised him to believe he was chosen by fate. As a child, Alexander was different from the other sons of nobles. He was brilliant, intense, and frighteningly ambitious. While other boys competed in games, Alexander obsessed over heroes. He slept with copies of the Iliad beneath his pillow and idolized Achilles as if the warrior were a living ancestor speaking directly to him through time. He admired strength, but even more than strength, he admired glory. To Alexander, death itself was acceptable if it meant his name would echo forever across the world. That obsession would become the fuel behind every battlefield, every city burned, and every empire shattered beneath his march. One day, a gigantic black horse was brought before the Macedonian court. The beast attacked anyone who tried to ride it. Soldiers failed. Nobles failed. Even hardened warriors were thrown into the dirt like broken dolls. The animal seemed untamable. But young Alexander noticed something nobody else saw. The horse was terrified of its own shadow. Calmly, he turned the horse toward the sun, blocking the shadow from its eyes, then mounted it in a single movement. The crowd watched in silence as the prince rode across the fields with complete control. The horse's name was Bucephalus, and it would carry Alexander through some of the greatest battles in history. According to legend, Philip looked at his son with tears in his eyes and declared, "Macedon is too small for you." But greatness has a price long before victory arrives. Alexander grew up inside a kingdom filled with paranoia, betrayal, and violence. His father conquered cities by day and crushed political enemies by night. Assassination was not rare in royal courts. It was expected. Alexander learned early that power did not belong to the kind or the merciful. It belonged to those willing to seize it with absolute force. To prepare his son for rule, Philip hired one of the greatest minds in history, Aristotle. Under Aristotle's teachings, Alexander studied philosophy, science, medicine, politics, and literature. Yet while Aristotle taught him how to think, the world around him taught him how to survive. Between philosophy lessons and military campaigns, Alexander became something terrifyingly rare, a man with both intellectual brilliance and unstoppable ambition. As Alexander entered his teenage years, his hunger for glory intensified. He joined military campaigns beside his father and experienced battle before most boys his age had even held a sword. At the Battle of Corinthia, he led cavalry charges with such aggression that hardened soldiers began to fear the prince's fearlessness. He fought as if death itself could not touch him. The Greeks who resisted Macedon saw a glimpse of the future that day. A young commander who moved across battlefields like a force of nature, striking with speed so violent it shattered enemy formations before they could even react. Philip may have built the Macedonian war machine, but Alexander already looked destined to become its ultimate weapon. Yet beneath the victories, tension between father and son slowly grew sharper. Philip's expanding power changed the royal court into a nest of rivalries. New marriages threatened Alexander's position as heir. Nobles whispered about succession. Allies became enemies overnight. During a drunken celebration, Philip reportedly insulted Alexander publicly, causing the prince to explode in fury before the entire court. For a moment, the empire stood on the edge of collapse from within. The conqueror who dreamed of invading Persia suddenly faced conflict inside his own bloodline. Alexander left the kingdom temporarily, carrying with him not only rage, but also the terrifying realization that destiny could be stolen if he hesitated even once. Then the unthinkable happened. In 336 BCE, Philip II of Macedon was assassinated during a public ceremony. Chaos erupted instantly. Enemies celebrated. Rivals prepared to tear the kingdom apart. Macedon stood vulnerable, surrounded by Greek city-states waiting for rebellion and foreign powers eager to destroy Philip's empire before it fully matured. In that moment, a 20-year-old Alexander stepped forward into the storm. Many believed he was too young, too reckless, too inexperienced. They were catastrophically wrong. The moment Alexander the Great claimed the throne, the ancient world smelled weakness. Greek city-states that had bowed to Macedon under Philip's iron rule suddenly rebelled, convinced the young king would collapse under pressure. To them, Alexander was only a boy wearing a dead conqueror's crown. But Alexander understood something terrifyingly simple. Fear disappears the instant power hesitates. So he moved before his enemies could breathe. Like a lightning strike descending from the mountains of Macedon, he launched military campaigns with ruthless speed, crushing revolts before they could unite into a true resistance. The city of Thebes became the ultimate example. Once one of the most powerful cities in Greece, Thebes believed Macedonian control had weakened after Philip's death. The citizens revolted, killed Macedonian officers, and prepared for war. Many expected Alexander to negotiate. Others assumed he would struggle to even arrive in time. Instead, he marched hundreds of kilometers with impossible speed and appeared outside the city walls like a nightmare materializing from thin air. Panic exploded inside Thebes. The young king offered them one final chance to surrender. They refused. What followed became one of the most brutal warnings in ancient history. Macedonian forces stormed the city with overwhelming violence. Streets turned into slaughter grounds. Buildings burned. Thousands were killed. Survivors were dragged into slavery, while much of the city itself was destroyed. Greece watched in absolute horror. Alexander did not simply defeat Thebes. He erased it as a warning to the rest of the Greek world. The message was clear. The son of Philip was even more dangerous than the father. After Thebes fell, rebellion across Greece collapsed almost instantly. Fear had returned, and Alexander now stood unchallenged as ruler of Macedon and leader of the Greek alliance. But Greece was never Alexander's final goal. Ever since childhood, he had dreamed of surpassing heroes like Achilles. Greece itself was too small for the scale of glory he desired. Beyond the Aegean Sea stood the greatest empire on earth, the mighty Achaemenid Empire of Persia. For over 2 centuries, Persia dominated vast territories stretching across Asia, controlling unimaginable wealth, gigantic armies, and ancient cities filled with gold and power. Kings before Alexander feared Persia. Alexander intended to conquer it. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed into Asia with roughly 40,000 soldiers. Compared to Persia's enormous resources, his army looked laughably small. But Macedon possessed something Persia underestimated completely: discipline, innovation, and Alexander himself. He did not command from behind golden walls or distant tents. He fought at the very front of battle, riding beside his cavalry, charging directly into enemy lines where death was most certain. To his soldiers, this made him almost supernatural. To his enemies, it made him terrifying. The first major clash came at the Battle of the Granicus. Persian forces positioned themselves behind a riverbank, believing the terrain would stop the Macedonian advance. Crossing under enemy attack was considered nearly suicidal. Even Alexander's own generals warned him against immediate assault. He ignored them completely. At dawn, Macedonian cavalry smashed into the river while arrows and spears rained down upon them. Water turned red with blood as men drowned beneath armor and horses collapsed under impact. In the chaos, Alexander personally led the attack straight toward the Persian commanders. The fighting became savage and intimate. Persian nobles recognized Alexander instantly and attempted to kill him directly. At one point, an enemy warrior raised an axe above Alexander's exposed head and nearly ended history in a single swing. Only the intervention of one of Alexander's companions saved his life at the final second. But instead of retreating, Alexander drove deeper into the battlefield, cutting through Persian lines with relentless aggression. Eventually, the Persian army collapsed. Thousands fled. Others were slaughtered where they stood. The victory at Granicus changed everything. Suddenly, the impossible no longer seemed impossible. Greek cities along the coast of Asia Minor began surrendering to Alexander, some welcoming him as a liberator from Persian rule. But Alexander's campaign was not built on mercy alone. He understood that conquest required both inspiration and fear. Cities that cooperated were rewarded. Cities that resisted faced annihilation. Every victory expanded his legend, and every legend attracted more soldiers willing to follow him into what increasingly looked like destiny itself. As Alexander advanced deeper into Asia, stories about him spread faster than armies could march. Some called him a genius blessed by the gods. Others called him a demon wearing human flesh. Persian officials expected the invasion to slow down eventually. Instead, Alexander accelerated. He moved with terrifying momentum, refusing to allow the Persian Empire time to reorganize. This was not ordinary warfare anymore. It was a storm swallowing entire kingdoms before they even understood what was happening. Then news arrived that the Persian king himself, Darius III, was preparing to confront Alexander personally. The ruler of the greatest empire on earth was finally moving against the young conqueror from Macedon. Ahead waited colossal armies, impossible odds, and battles that would decide the fate of civilization itself. But Alexander did not fear the coming war. For him, this was the moment history had been building toward since the night he was born beneath a sky filled with thunder. The armies of Darius III stretched across the horizon like a living ocean. Persian banners covered the plains, glittering beneath the sun with the wealth of an empire that ruled millions. War chariots lined the battlefield. Mercenaries from distant lands stood ready beside elite Persian warriors. Against this colossal force marched the smaller army of Alexander the Great, a king barely in his 20s who continued charging directly toward the most powerful empire on earth as if fear itself no longer applied to him. The two forces met near the Battle of Issus. Despite Persia's enormous numerical advantage, the narrow terrain worked against Darius, compressing his massive army into chaos while Macedonian discipline remained intact. Alexander immediately recognized the weakness. Instead of cautiously defending, he launched a direct assault straight toward the Persian king himself. That was Alexander's style of warfare. Cut the head off the empire and the body collapses behind it. The battlefield erupted into madness. Spears shattered. Horses screamed in terror. Macedonian phalanxes pushed forward like moving walls of iron, while Persian arrows darkened the sky above them. Alexander rode at the front, his armor stained with dust and blood, driving his cavalry directly toward Darius. Persian soldiers desperately tried to stop him, but Alexander's attacks came with such speed and violence that enemy formations broke apart before they could fully react. Then the impossible happened. Darius panicked. The king of Persia abandoned the battlefield and fled. The sight of their ruler escaping shattered Persian morale instantly. Soldiers who moments earlier stood as part of the world's greatest empire suddenly collapsed into terrified chaos. Thousands were cut down while fleeing. Others threw away their weapons and ran for survival. Alexander had not merely won a battle. He had humiliated the Persian Empire before the entire ancient world. Inside the abandoned Persian camp, Alexander discovered unimaginable treasures, gold, royal equipment, and even the captured family of Darius himself. The mother, wife, and daughters of the Persian king expected humiliation or execution. Instead, Alexander shocked everyone by treating them with dignity and respect. It was a calculated move as much as a moral one. Alexander understood the power of image. He wanted the world to see him not as a savage destroyer, but as the rightful ruler replacing Persia's failing king. Yet beneath the image of honor remained a terrifying reality. Alexander's ambition had become unstoppable. After Issus, city after city fell before him. Some surrendered peacefully. Others resisted and paid horrific prices. One of the greatest challenges awaited at the island fortress city of Tyre. Protected by towering walls and surrounded by the sea, Tyre believed itself impossible to conquer. Alexander offered peaceful surrender. The city refused him. That single decision triggered one of the most insane siege operations in ancient history. Unable to attack the island directly, Alexander ordered his army to build a gigantic causeway through the sea itself. Stone by stone, his soldiers advanced toward the city while defenders rained arrows, fire, and death upon them from the walls. The siege dragged on for months. Storms destroyed construction. Enemy ships attacked repeatedly. Men drowned, burned alive, or died beneath collapsing structures. Most kings would have abandoned the assault. Alexander became more obsessed with victory the longer resistance continued. Finally, Macedonian forces breached the walls. What followed was catastrophic. Tyre was overwhelmed in brutal urban warfare. Thousands were killed. Many survivors were sold into slavery. The once proud fortress became another warning carved into history by Alexander's campaign. Resistance meant destruction. Every victory increased both his legend and his ruthlessness. He was evolving into something larger than a king, a force consuming the ancient world piece by piece. After Tyre, Alexander marched south into Egypt, where he was welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a liberator from Persian rule. Egyptian priests crowned him as a divine ruler, strengthening the myth that Alexander was favored by the gods themselves. In the deserts, he journeyed to the Oracle of Siwa, a sacred temple hidden deep within the sands. Ancient sources claim the oracle addressed him as the son of Zeus. Whether true or not, the experience transformed Alexander completely. He no longer merely believed he was destined for greatness. He began believing he was something beyond ordinary humanity. In Egypt, he founded the city of Alexandria, envisioning it as a center of culture, knowledge, and power that would outlive him for centuries. Even amid endless war, Alexander thought about immortality, not just through conquest, but through civilization itself. He wanted his name woven permanently into the fabric of human history. But Persia still lived. Far to the east, Darius was gathering another massive army for one final confrontation. The coming battle would decide whether Alexander's invasion ended as a legendary campaign or whether he would become master of the largest empire the world had ever seen. The final confrontation came on the vast plains near Battle of Gaugamela. Darius III had prepared carefully this time. The battlefield was flattened specifically for Persian war chariots. Massive armies gathered from every corner of the empire. Cavalry from Central Asia, elite guards from Persia, mercenaries, archers, and armored warriors beyond counting. Ancient historians exaggerated numbers wildly, but one fact remained undeniable. Alexander's forces were still vastly outnumbered. Before the battle, Darius offered peace. He promised gold, territory, and even family alliances if Alexander the Great would stop his invasion. One of Alexander's generals famously said that if he were Alexander, he would accept the offer immediately. Alexander replied, "So would I, if I were Parmenion." The answer revealed everything about him. He no longer wanted compromise. He wanted the entire empire. As dawn rose over Gaugamela, tension spread across both armies like poison in the air. Persian troops extended so far across the plains that they appeared endless. Many Macedonian soldiers understood they were about to fight the greatest battle of their lives against impossible odds. But Alexander rode among them with absolute calm, wearing shining armor beneath the early sunlight. To his men, he looked less like a king and more like a myth stepping into reality. Then the battle began. Persian chariots charged first, blades attached to their wheels designed to tear infantry apart. The ground shook beneath thousands of advancing horses. But Macedonian discipline held firm. Soldiers opened gaps in their formations, trapping and destroying the chariots as they passed through. Arrows darkened the sky. Cavalry collisions erupted across the battlefield with horrifying violence. Men vanished beneath hooves and spear thrusts while dust swallowed entire sections of the war zone. In the middle of the chaos, Alexander saw his opportunity. Just as he had done before, he targeted Darius directly. Leading his elite companion cavalry, Alexander launched a wedge-shaped assault straight toward the Persian king. The attack smashed through enemy lines with terrifying momentum. Persian soldiers desperately tried to stop the charge, but Alexander's cavalry moved like a spear, piercing the heart of the empire itself. And once again, Darius fled. The sight shattered Persian morale completely. Soldiers broke ranks across the battlefield. Entire sections of the Persian army collapsed into panic. What began as the largest defense of the empire transformed into a catastrophic rout. Alexander had achieved the impossible. At Gaugamela, he destroyed the military power of Persia forever. After the battle, the road to the heart of the empire lay open. Alexander marched into the legendary cities of Babylon, Susa, and eventually Persepolis itself. The treasures inside these cities were beyond imagination. Gold overflowed from royal vaults. Palaces displayed wealth gathered across centuries of conquest. For many soldiers, it felt like entering the center of the world. Then came one of the most controversial moments in Alexander's life. Inside Persepolis, during a night of celebration and drinking, fires erupted within the royal palace complex. Ancient sources disagree whether Alexander ordered the burning deliberately as revenge for Persia's past invasions of Greece, or whether the destruction spiraled out of control during drunken festivities. Either way, flames consumed the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire. Towers collapsed into infernos, while priceless symbols of Persian power turned into ash beneath the night sky. It was more than destruction. It was the symbolic death of an empire. Yet Alexander did not stop. Even after conquering Persia, he continued chasing Darius across the eastern territories. Eventually, Darius was betrayed and murdered by his own men before Alexander could capture him alive. When Alexander discovered the body of the fallen king, he reportedly covered it with his own cloak out of respect. The conqueror who destroyed Persia now declared himself the legitimate successor to the Persian throne. But victory was changing him. As the years passed, Alexander became increasingly isolated, suspicious, and consumed by ambition. He adopted Persian customs, wore royal Eastern clothing, and demanded forms of respect that shocked many Macedonians. Some of his closest companions believed he was forgetting who he truly was. Others feared power itself was transforming him into the kind of ruler he once fought against. Then paranoia turned deadly. During a drunken argument, Alexander killed one of his most trusted friends, Clitus the Black, the very man who had once saved his life in battle. The murder horrified his companions. For Alexander himself, it became a moment of deep psychological collapse. The line between glorious conqueror and tragic tyrant was beginning to disappear. But even with the Persian Empire defeated and endless riches already under his control, Alexander's hunger remained unsatisfied. Because somewhere beyond the known world, farther east than any Greek king had ever marched, new lands still waited to be conquered. By now, Alexander the Great ruled an empire larger than anything the Greek world had ever imagined. From the mountains of Macedon to the shattered heart of Persia, entire civilizations bowed beneath his name. Gold flooded his treasuries. Kings surrendered without battle. Cities carried his banner across continents. For most rulers, it would have been enough. For Alexander, it was only the beginning. He pushed eastward into territories many Greeks considered the edge of the world itself. The campaigns became harsher with every passing year. Mountains froze his armies. Deserts swallowed men whole beneath unbearable heat. Local resistance turned savage as unfamiliar kingdoms fought desperately against Macedonian expansion. Yet Alexander continued forward with relentless obsession. driven by a belief that destiny had no limits. He no longer conquered for survival, revenge, or even wealth. He conquered because stopping felt impossible. Eventually, his army crossed into the lands near India, where they encountered powerful kingdoms unlike anything they had faced before. The most famous clash came at the Battle of the Hydaspes against King Porus. Unlike many rulers who fled before Alexander, Porus stood his ground proudly, commanding war elephants towering above the battlefield like living monsters. For the Macedonians, the sight was terrifying. Horses panicked at the smell and noise of the elephants. Soldiers who had survived years of conquest suddenly faced creatures capable of crushing entire formations beneath massive feet. Rainstorms turned the battlefield into mud while thunder echoed across the riverbanks. Yet Alexander once again adapted with brutal efficiency. He used deception, mobility, and surprise attacks to outmaneuver Porus before launching a coordinated assault against the Indian forces. The battle became chaos incarnate. Elephants trampled soldiers into the earth. Spears shattered against armor and flesh. Men screamed beneath rain and blood as Macedonian troops fought desperately to avoid being crushed alive. But despite the carnage, Alexander prevailed. Porus was eventually captured and brought before the conqueror. When Alexander asked how he wished to be treated, Porus answered simply, like a king. Alexander smiled. For perhaps the first time in years, he saw a reflection of himself inside another ruler: pride, courage, and refusal to kneel before fear. Instead of humiliating Porus, Alexander restored him as king under Macedonian rule. It was both respect and strategy combined. Alexander understood that ruling an empire required more than destruction alone. But while Alexander's ambition remained limitless, his army was finally breaking. For years, his soldiers had marched across endless battlefields far from home. They had crossed deserts, climbed mountains, survived massacres, sieges, and impossible wars. Thousands were dead. Many who survived were exhausted physically and spiritually. When Alexander announced plans to march even farther east toward unknown kingdoms, the army refused. Not rebelled, refused. For the first time in his life, Alexander could not force destiny forward through sheer willpower alone. His men begged to return home. Some wept openly. Others stood in exhausted silence after nearly a decade of nonstop conquest. Alexander isolated himself for days, furious that his dream of reaching the ends of the earth would remain unfinished. But eventually, even he understood the truth. An empire cannot move if the men carrying it collapse. Reluctantly, Alexander turned back. The journey home became almost as deadly as the wars themselves. Harsh terrain, starvation, disease, and brutal conditions killed countless soldiers during the return westward. The endless campaigns that built Alexander's legend were now consuming the remnants of his army piece by piece. And somewhere along the journey, the unstoppable conqueror himself began to fade. In 323 BCE, inside the city of Babylon, Alexander suddenly fell ill. Ancient accounts describe fever, weakness, exhaustion, and a slow physical collapse. Some believed he was poisoned. Others blamed disease, alcohol, accumulated wounds, or years of relentless warfare, destroying his body from within. The truth remains uncertain even today. But as the fever worsened, the ruler who conquered most of the known world lost the ability to speak clearly. His generals gathered around his bed, waiting for final instructions. According to legend, when asked who would inherit the empire, Alexander whispered, "To the strongest." Then the conqueror died at only 32 years old. No clear successor, no stable future, no final peace. The empire he forged through fire immediately began tearing itself apart as his generals turned against one another in wars that lasted for decades. Yet even as the empire fractured, Alexander's impact on history became immortal. His conquests spread Greek culture across vast regions of the world, reshaping politics, trade, science, warfare, and civilization itself. Cities he founded survived for centuries. His name evolved into myth. To some, Alexander was a visionary hero. To others, a brilliant destroyer addicted to conquest. But one fact remains undeniable. More than 2,000 years later, the shadow of Alexander the Great still marches across history like an unconquered legend.